I want to thank the Arts and Sciences Committee on Equity and Diversity at Columbia for sponsoring this series. And also I want to thank the Heyman Center and the Society of Fellows for hosting very graciously, and Anya Wilkening and the Department of Music for their assistance in organizing this and with all the logistics. And I'm especially grateful, of course, to the panelists who are going to participate today: Callum Blackmore of the Department of Music, Seth Kimmel of Latin American and Iberian Studies, Mattia Tommasino of the Department of Italian, Michelle Wilson of Columbia University Libraries, Alex Giel of Columbia University Libraries, and Kaiama Glover of the Barnard Department of French. And I think I just got that out of order. The last speaker will be Michelle Wilson. So please put in the chat why you are attending today, if you wish, and what you hope to learn from this event. While people are writing in and joining the Zoom meeting, I'm going to be leading off with a few framing points. And I wanted to start by saying that peer review is something that many people think of as somewhat mysterious. And part of the reason is that the journals may have different procedures, and journals do not always explicitly set forth the stages of peer review and the procedures that authors are undergoing. They may not explain every step. And this may be something that we should think about as editors of journals. So the form of peer review that is often considered the gold standard is double-blind peer review. And that means that scholars who are asked to review a submission for a journal do not see the author's name until the article gets published, if it's accepted, and the author does not know who wrote the reader's reports. But not all review is double-blind, but that's the double-blind procedure. Now, the use of double-blind, of anonymity, obligates reviewers to evaluate the work without the kind of personal or professional baggage that could influence reading otherwise. So factors such as gender identity, age, career stage, and affiliation, geographical location of authors could all be factors that would influence people if they read or, for instance, see a conference presentation. And as an editor, I have personally seen many reviews that, had the author's identity been known to the reviewer, would have been much less impartial. I believe that reviewers would be influenced if they knew more about the identity of authors, and I believe it would prevent them from reading the work impartially. So the vast majority of reviews I've seen are invaluable. They're constructive criticism. They may be harsh, but often even the harshest are very constructive, very detailed, very informative, and these make the articles better. So in my mind, the anonymity of double-blind peer review makes for a more careful reading, a more intellectually focused reading that may be better because it takes place outside of these settings, such as conferences where there's an overt power relationship, settings also such as advising, such as teaching at universities. There are many, many settings in which power relations simply dominate the experience of intellectual exchange. And of course, the role of the editor then is to mediate between the author and the reviewers. And this is an ethical responsibility as well as an intellectual responsibility. I would like to add also that the author has responsibilities that are both ethical and intellectual. And the peer reviewers have ethical responsibilities as well. Now, these are things we'll get back to in this workshop and in others. But I also want to mention the matter of gender. As a female editor, I and my co-editor have witnessed, and we've been subject to behaviors from authors and from peer reviewers that reflect the prevalent gender biases we see in academia in general. And the work of editing also is intertwined not only in gendered ways, but in ways that deal with race, ethnicity, class, with the labor of many other people, some of whom the authors don't know about or never would ever meet, some of whom we as editors never meet in person for any reason. And these people who are spread out are essential to journal publishing. They include the copy editors, the editorial assistants, the production staff, the publishers' representatives, all kinds of people. And so in these interactions, among the many parts of the complex process of publishing, there are interactions that are conditioned by gender, by ethnicity, by race, by class, and by other kinds of socioeconomic conditions. And publishing, we all know, I hope, is also an economic enterprise. It's a business. So just in general, I hope for this series as a whole, the 3 events, to shed light and to reflect thoughtfully on these aspects, these facets of journal publishing. Now, the last thing I want to say, and I believe Anya is going to put this into the screen share, based on my experience specifically in the last 4 years as the co-editor of Gesta, I would like to offer the following advice in general. This applies, I hope, across the board. Before you submit your work, get someone to read your work and to give you feedback. And read the submission guidelines for a journal very carefully, follow them rigorously. This may sound like the most obvious thing in the world, but 90% of people who submit, for instance, to Gesta, which is a medieval art history journal that we publish, that we edit for University of Chicago Press, do not follow all the guidelines. And when you get reviews, even if you feel somewhat upset or slightly compromised or wounded or whatever, take the reviews as valuable input, because I really do think most of the time, in fact, almost all the time, that's how they're intended. No matter how critical they are, you're getting a closer reading than you may ever have gotten before for your work. And you have the right to disagree. You don't have to take everything that the reviewer says if you disagree with it. And if you're asked to respond in writing to the peer reviewers, write a detailed response. Show that you have taken on board, or at least taken seriously, these criticisms and the input. Some of our reviewers they put extraordinary effort into writing these reviews. And I know that I myself do that when I write a peer review. Respond promptly and respond fully to correspondence from editors. Always try to think about what is the professional way to interact. Follow instructions, read and follow instructions. And finally, and I hope this is something we've all thought about a lot more in the age of pandemic, think about how your actions affect others. Think about how your decisions may be affecting others, people you don't even know, like the copy editor, for instance. How do they affect others, as well as how do they affect you, yourself? So with that, I would like to turn the proceedings over to my panelists that I've invited, and I'm absolutely delighted to see questions in the chat. We're going to be getting to these questions as we go. So I'd like to first invite Callum Blackmore, who has been the editor of Current Musicology, which is a musicology journal published at Columbia and completely edited by graduate students, and always has, to lead off with his thoughts. So Callum, thank you for joining us. And I'd like to know what you consider most important for authors to know about peer review, and what you've learned from the time that you've spent as the editor of a journal run by graduate students coordinating peer review.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I feel like I'm a kind of, I see in the chat people are kind of introducing themselves, and there's a lot of like junior faculty and very kind of experienced people, and I feel like I'm like a minnow in a room full of marlins here. I mean, I came into this process very naive, very green, knowing nothing about peer review. I mean, this was my appointment as a graduate student. I was appointed for 9 months to run this journal, knowing nothing about peer review, and I kind of came in knowing nothing, and I naively thought it would be this kind of mechanical process. In fact, I thought it was, to be really frank with you, I thought it was going to be kind of busy work. I thought I would get the manuscripts in, and then I would simply send it out to a bunch of peer reviewers, and then I would get them back, and then I would send them back to the authors. And I thought it would just be writing emails. And I thought it would just, be a process that ran itself. And I just had no idea of the kind of complexities and the considerations of the labor considerations and the kind of triage and frankly the care that needed to go into this role. And it turned out to be this kind of all-consuming thing for me. Not I think by the end of the year, and in fact, my role officially finished in at the end of spring, but I'm still working on getting this last issue out because this peer review process is still ongoing. It's been a process that has taken so much more time and so much more energy than I had accounted for. Maybe it would be useful to start by giving a bit of a background of maybe what it's about current musicology and these the kind of mechanics of labor in a kind of a graduate student journal. Current Musicology is a very old graduate student journal. It was founded in the 1960s and has been running. It's been run exclusively by graduate students in the music department at Columbia University since then, and members of the peer review board. The peer review board is entirely made up of graduate students in the Columbia Music Department. And that presents unique labor issues that I don't know much about other journals, but I think labor issues that are unique to journals like Current Musicology, in that editors are only on 9-month appointments. They're only there for the academic year, and then there's this massive turnover each year. So staff are constantly turning over. The review board is constantly turning over as people finish their PhDs. So there's not this kind of consistency that you might get in other journals, where you have editors who stick around for more than 2 issues. You have review board members who've been there for their entire careers. I know people who say have been on the board of like 18th century music for their entire for the entirety of the journal's existence. You don't get that with a journal like Current Musicology, so you don't get this knowledge that's being passed down. So when I entered the role, it was kind of like starting with nothing. There's no document that said these are what the peer review procedures are. It was a kind of oral tradition that I had to piece together, and each editor who was put in this position kind of did it a different way each time. And so I asked around, and Matthew, who had this role in 2012, he did it like this, and Lena did it like this, and so on and so forth. And you kind of have to piece together a best practice from that. So that was something that I think might be a kind of unique aspect of these kind of student-run journals. And there's this kind of ephemerality to these publications, which I think makes them unique. And I think there are pros and cons to that. I mean, the pros are that often there's a kind of there's a need to get issues out quickly. I had 9 months in which I was, was supposed to produce 2 issues. But then the cons of that are that there's not this there isn't a chance for kind of knowledge to cement over time. And I think if you're, submitting to a journal, a graduate student-run journal, these are the kinds of things that you might want to think about before submitting. You might run into kind of peer review issues in that respect. And I found it. I immediately encountered these enormous difficulties in terms of that we received 50 submissions for our first issue, which was fantastic, an enormous number. and I'd really gone out of my way to, advertise the call for papers in as many on as many emailing lists as possible. But we have about 20 members of the review board, and of those 20 members, we have about 15 people who are actually available to review. And so immediately there is this kind of triage process that needed to happen. So there's this huge kind of balance of labor that goes into producing these issues. And often people are reviewing multiple articles at a time, and a process that you think will take a couple of months ends up taking twice that amount of time, because you're waiting on people to review, multiple manuscripts. And this is, I think, where the process was so much more complicated than I expected. Is that you think it's going to be this thing that kind of runs itself, and it ends up involving a lot of decision making about how best to use the labor that you have, and how best to prioritize the submissions that come in, and you never know what's going to be coming through your door on that submission, on that deadline. And it's very exciting. You get all of these fantastic submissions. And I think this is where one of the central issues that I found with the fact that there's not a lot of where there's this high turnover of staff in this journal, is that we have a lot of things that are being revised and resubmitted that no one has seen before, because they've been revised and resubmitted from, say, 2012, and the people who worked on them in 2012 have already moved on. And so there's this whole extra level of labor and this whole extra level of kind of piecing things together that needs to go into rebuilding them. So there was this whole kind of extra layer of work that needed to happen, which I didn't anticipate. So I think there are all these kind of complexities that go into the peer review process that are kind of unique to student journals like Current Musicology.
Well, Callum, can we start the discussion of some of the points you make, because your
I'm
points
kind of rambling along.
but your points, what I really find actually really compelling about some of the points you're bringing up is there are some things that may be unique, but I would say a lot of these things are not unique. And so I think you've raised actually quite a few matters that are universal, and that are, but they may be articulated specifically in this time frame of a graduate student journal. But for instance, one thing I don't know if you mentioned this, but Current Musicology that I happen to know, and this is something that affects a lot of journals, is platform. There was a change of platform, publication platform of Current Musicology, and the mechanisms of publication and subscriptions and so on. That has been a big thing. So the peer review is one of these many aspects of kind of procedural challenges that you're referring to. And I know what you're saying about this question of something you think it might run itself, but in fact, there's both a process and a procedure in place, often an oral tradition. When we took over the editorship of the journal that I co-edit, we got notes and we got information, but we also had very intense meetings with the editors in order to receive kind of the wisdom of their experience. And there's really no substitute for that, but it's amazing how many procedures are not documented in writing. Also, one of the things you talked about with turnover, and this is something people should be aware of, is that, all the listeners on the call should be aware of, that there's a lot of turnover. So it's not, yes, I understand Current Musicology has to do with people graduating and stuff, and terms ending, but there's a lot of turnover. So many journals have assistants who are only appointed for a certain period of time. And so they move on and they're replaced by other assistants. also, editorial board members, at least in my experience, typically have a term limit. So there's a fixed term, and there has to be a turnover of editorial board members. We'll be talking, I believe, maybe more in subsequent workshops about what editorial board members do in various journals. Their roles can be more greater or less in terms of experience, in terms of involvement, and in terms of responsibility. But those roles typically do have turnover, and one of the most consequential forms of turnover I myself have experienced, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that the editors change, editorships, so yes, in current musicology, the term is shorter, but any editorial term, when that term ends and the next editors come in, it's a huge transition. And so people who are authors submitting their work for publication may not realize the extent to which there are transitions happening behind the scenes, whether sometimes in the publisher's own operation, there are transitions happening that authors may not be aware of. So these are matters that ultimately do affect peer review, although maybe not always as directly as a change of editorship. So editors, as we have found, editors may end up publishing in the journals that they co-edit. They may end up publishing articles that were accepted by the previous editors, or they may be in the process of doing peer review on articles at the moment of transition, and then the subsequent editors have to take over that peer review process from the previous editors, but the author remains the same and the reviewers remain the same. So this happens also in I would say, all journals, not only in current musicology. So let me see if we should, I've not been able to see if which messages in the chat would correlate with things that we can discuss further with Callum. I know that some of you have been reading the chat more closely than I. Anya, can you suggest one of the?
We've had a lot of interest in this idea of time frame, which I think we've addressed a little bit. Do you have recommendations for people for dealing with these sorts of issues?
I mean, one thing I noticed Callum mentioned the idea of the deadline. So some journals have a deadline for submissions, an annual deadline, and some journals have the rolling deadline. And, so that can affect when your article will be published. Some journals come out more often than others. And also time frame can vary. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to ask editors of a journal, what is the time frame? Does the journal have a backlog? What is the time frame for publication? In some journals like ours, the time frame between submission and publication in the print journal could be 2 years, because peer review takes a while, but the production process takes a while, depending on the journal. Art history may be more complicated than other journals. But those are, the time factor can vary widely, and the amount of time that one should wait to get a response, for instance, could vary widely between different journals. So I feel like people need to be proactive if they submit something and they don't get a response. But of course, shouldn't be annoying, but they should realize sometimes that it's time to ask if there's a response to their article. The other thing is that people should be aware of how long it takes to publish. So I saw a number of things in the chat about, I was thinking of publishing, it seems like other people have published and I haven't, or I feel like I should be publishing. It's a delicate balance, and I want to hear what the other panelists have to say, because on the one hand, you don't want to jump into print with bright ideas, that you don't want to rush ahead with something that's not fully ripened. But on the other hand, you have to allow for that long time frame. You have to allow for that possible up to 2 years after you've submitted something before it actually might come out. So other questions, because then we're going to be moving on to the next. So the plan for today, in case this wasn't clear, is we're going to take some of the chat questions, and then we're going to be cycling through all of the presenters. And then at the end, we'll still have a lot of time for going back to a lot of questions. So in terms of the time frame, would any of our other panelists like to speak up, or maybe Callum, could you first just quickly mention is there a typical time frame in current musicology?
Well, yeah, because I was under kind of obligation for my position to publish 2 issues per year, generally, if an article gets accepted with revisions on the first round of peer review, it can get published within a kind of 6-month period. But then if revisions are required, it can take a couple of years and a couple of kind of editorships. So as you were saying, like in the first issue I published, I published a couple of articles that were kind of 2 editors before me had kind of accepted under a kind of revise and resubmit.
And that's actually something else I wanted to mention is we have widely varying experiences as editors of the cycle of revise and resubmit, and people sometimes, again, when you're publishing, you want it to be good. You have to take the time it takes to be good, to write something good, but to take forever to resubmit what you've been sent back as a revise and resubmit, which is a very frequent occurrence that people's work, gets sent back with the reader's reports and they're told, please revise and resubmit. To take forever to do that is, in my opinion, a tactical error, because those months expand, and then there's the pipeline and the cycle. And before you know it, as you just said, that's a big difference. 6 months and 2 years, it's a big difference. But when people take a while to revise, that's what happens. And, careers may be affected by whether an article is accepted or not. It may not be affected by whether your article is out or not, but the acceptance, and then, these are things to think about. Right. And then also Alex mentioned in the chat, the call between call for proposals to publication. Many journals don't have a call for proposals. So you just have to, dive in there without there being a formal call, but then many journals do have a formal call and deadlines. So can we before we move on to the next speakers, would other people like to say anything about timeline that they would like to share? I don't know if we can see you raising your hand.
I can add something, although I'm not an official speaker. May I add something?
Yes, because Shannon, you work for Speculum, right?
For Res, actually.
For Res, sorry,
Yeah,
go on.
It's okay. Res Anthropology and Aesthetics, and I was just kind of typing a comment, but maybe I'll say it out loud that a bit of advice, just in my experience as a managing editor and as a copy editor, that a great way to shorten the timeline between submission and publication is to make sure that the article is well edited before it's been submitted. So and this is not just looking at the submission guidelines, which is, as Susan said, is so crucial. And it's so true that I very rarely get an essay where the guidelines have been carefully read, but whatever you need to do, and this absolutely goes, it's true for those for whom English is not a first language or primary language, but it's absolutely the case for native English speakers as well. Do whatever you can, even if you can't afford to hire a copy editor in advance, have a friend read it or a colleague. Because there will just be so many things that you notice that they will notice that you haven't. In terms of perhaps argumentation, but also just language as well, because I just spend so much of my own time, I find, just working on that. And it does slow down the process, frankly.
Yeah, and we as editors have very, very, very often had to send things back. We can't send it out for peer review until it gets further editing before we even could start that process. So I agree that this is the very beginning of the pipeline the very beginning of the process is where the most attention and care is really needed. Thank you very much, Shannon. Can we, anybody else among our group, or shall we move on? Maybe we should just move on in the interest of time, because we're going to get back to everything eventually. So I would like to move on to the second journal that we have co-editors or co-associate editors, 2 of the associate editors of Romanic Review here with us today. Mattia Tommasino from the Department of Italian, Seth Kimmel from Latin American Iberian Cultures. And so they're both associate editors of Romanic Review. And so I wanted to ask them, these are kind of opening questions. Obviously they can talk about other things, but how does your work as editors of Romanic Review promote greater diversity in the field or address issues of diversity or of language diversity? And how does publishing in Romanic Review work for authors at different career stages? This is something Mattia has spoken about previously, and authors who are members of different academic communities and intellectual communities.
Seth.
Yeah, so I guess I can speak first. My name is Seth Kimmel. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures here at Columbia. I'm here, I guess, to talk in my capacity as an associate editor at a Romanic Review. Mattia and I came on at around the same time, about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, as part of an effort to bring Romanic Review back to its sort of Romance languages roots. So I'm trying to bring more Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, Galician conversation to the journal. I think Mattia is trying to do the same for Italian. Many of the publications and the sort of networks of reviewers and readers and sort of interlocutors at Romanic Review have been French focused for the recent past. And so this is kind of part of our effort to, in conversation with Elisabeth Ladenson, who's the main editor, to sort of transform the journal. So, one level of diversification of the field just has to do with language here in the context of the Romanic Review. But in the course of, rethinking the emphasis of the journal, we've also talked a lot about, the composition of the editorial board and the composition of the advisory board. And to the best of our ability, we've tried to keep, gender and race and language and location, geography, all in mind when we're thinking about how to think about those boards. We had long conversations about the bylaws of the journal and thinking about how the review process ought to work. And just as a general rule, there's usually one internal reader and 1 or 2 external readers, sometimes more. So there's a kind of process where usually at least the internal reader weighs in some way and often suggests in conversation with the editors, the external readers. And I'm also on the journal the Revista Hispánica Moderna, which is published here in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures, and it's something similar works there. So there's kind of this dialogue between the specialist, oftentimes the more specialist reader on the outside, and a couple of people who are readers on the inside. Of course, many journals I think are sort of, not all, but many journals are sort of housed in a particular department or a particular institution. And that I think is, it facilitates a certain kind of conversation that can be restricted. And so part of the effort is to kind of widen the networks of reviewers and readers as best we can, and to seek out guidance if we receive articles that we don't know the field well, to try and find people who do know the field better, to try and widen the conversation a little bit. As far as the nitty gritty of publishing, there are sort of different ways in. We do solicit and receive proposals for special issues. And there, the editors of the special issues have a little more control over the process. And that's one way where we can really try and, curate particular directions for the Romanic Review. So that's kind of exciting and interesting to think about, different ways that the journal could take steps in new directions. And then people regularly send articles directly, just off the cuff submissions. And part of our roles now is to try and encourage more people from fields that wouldn't maybe often see themselves in the Romanic Review, to encourage people to consider Romanic Review as a place to publish, to try and build out a more true and porous and flexible and global sense of what romance philology might be. So I think I'll just leave it at that. Maybe Mattia, you want to take it away here?
Yes. So thank you very much for this invitation. And I would like to speak, of course, as associate editor, but also as author and peer reviewer, because as an Italianist, but also as an Italian who worked in different contexts, before in Italy as a student and postdoc, then in Spain, and then coming here to the United States, also came across similar but also different publishing context, journals, review process, and so on. So the double-blind review, of course, is worldwide, it's diffused, but also as an author, I had reviews from the entire board of a journal, for example, in Italy. That was a very interesting experience as an author to receive comments on my first articles when I was starting writing from the entire board, small board, but from the board of the journal. So coming from these different experiences and now also being an associate editor of a Romanic review, I hope to bring this experience in the work of the editor. And looking at many of the questions about where to publish and where to put our first articles and so on, that's something very important. Also to understand very well our field and understand what are globally the places where we want to publish, and how, as Seth Kimmel was saying, our journal also develop, no, and change and take different directions. So understanding our own field means also understanding where we want to publish the journals we would like to be part of course, considering the timing, no? But something to try to put in a balance, both the timing, the process of publishing, and the prestige of the journal, for example, or the journal that we like to publish on, and so on. So try to balance that is very important, I think. So to have an idea of the field in relation to the places where we can publish. And what we were saying before, and was also the workshop, no? The workshop before presenting articles. So that's I think it's very important. And the peer readers, so reading between colleagues and friends. For example, for me, coming from Europe and coming to the United States was very helpful. And we did the first years I was here at Columbia with Seth Kimmel, a lot of readings of our articles. So that workshop was certainly important. No? So from the point of view of an editor now, I think was very important what we were saying before about the mediation, no? The role of mediation that can be between schools, between disciplines, and so on. No? So when, as an editor, we have to send out article for peer review, we have to also take in consideration these things. No? So how an article, for example, on medieval poetry, written with a more philosophical understanding of medieval poetry, can be judged by, for example, strict philologists and so on. No? So how this can nourish the discussion, also create problem to the author, and so on. So there's the role of a mediator, I think, is very important. And I hope for this journal to also bring, as we were saying before, into dialogue in the field of Italian studies, but of course across discipline, also people from different schools, people from different national tradition of studying the same topic, and so on. So this is one of the goal of our collaboration, and to expand the idea of Romance languages. Now that and Romanic review and the discipline itself. So that for sure could be interesting. And a journal like Romanic review is interesting because for Italianists is also a very important journal for a career in Italy, no? Because there is a classification of journals, and according to this classification, you have then access to public application to be an associate professor. No? So it's called and each discipline has its own journals. So in that sense, is a journal that functions very well also across different academic cultures. So this is a very general, but certainly I think the looking at the questions, what is very interesting for me is in these meeting is also the aspect of mentoring and understanding where we want to publish, how long, and trying to arrive to the peer review with a product that we are happy with.
Yeah, I want to say I agree extremely strongly with Mattia, because what I've observed has been that there's a lack of mentoring. And I don't mean that people are guilty of not mentoring. I just think there are many circumstances that are making mentoring very difficult. And I think that a lot of people are finding themselves, you know, not necessarily at sea, but it's hard times. So one of the advantages, if you can get an article peer reviewed, is sometimes the peer review, the reports of these peer reviewers may be the best, closest reading not only that you've ever had, but that you will ever have. And it almost, of course, it's going to be somebody possibly more specialized in the topic than your own dissertation advisor. But, you know, for some people, they've never had that kind of close reading. They just haven't benefited from that for a host of reasons. So that's even a reason to undertake peer review, to undertake sending your article, sending your work to a really top flight peer reviewed journal where you know you'll get those reviews, because you're going to get more input than the input that you really need to take your work to the next level. But again, it is very hard. Not everybody has access to the kind of support and mentoring that they need to make it happen. I would encourage people to do it, because you know, each journal is different. I can't speak on behalf of every journal, but you know, I think editors of journals are aware of their role in also moving scholarship forward and moving and working with different generations of scholars. And I think people are aware. We've recently encountered an ethical issue where, you know, we were it made us aware of, we are stewards in a way, we're intellectual stewards. We are working with people whose work may need more input or less input, but we need to consider submissions that may not be 100% ready to be published, but we need to give feedback to those authors. And sometimes there's some journals that work with authors through several drafts. The authors, like, there can be revise and resubmit, you know, 3 times. It's not unheard of, and that can result in publication. So I think we all want to think carefully. Not everybody's obligated to do everything a certain way. Journals can all be different, but we want to all think very carefully about what is our stance, what is our position in this world of emerging scholarship? Where do we stand in relation to that? How are we fostering it? How do we, you know, where do we make those hard decisions? You know, desk reject. So everybody should know that there's a thing called a desk reject, that sometimes when a journal receives, sometimes it's more than sometimes, and sometimes it's frequent, when a journal receives a submission that is simply not at all either the type of submission or the quality of submission, and it's clear that there's no chance that this submission will make it through peer review. Desk reject is you know, when the submission is rejected without being sent out for peer review, and that exists as well. And each type of reaction has its own justification, has its own logic. I want to, sorry, go on. Yes,
something I read in in the questions that some people are asking if it's good to contact the journal and so on, to in advance. And I would say yes. I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm entering the world of editing, but to contact and ask questions is always could be always helpful, no? To have more if there is after reading, of course, all the guidelines and so on, but I mean, to touch base is always important, and be in contact with the journals.
Sometimes there are perfectly reasonable questions that people want to ask. I mean, perfectly reasonable about images for guests in the case of Gesta. Sometimes, you know, I think it's perfectly, we all are perfectly willing to answer questions that people need to ask. Let me just see. Please, Seth, go ahead.
I was just going to say that one question that we've gotten recently has to do with open access. You know, some scholars have either just the desire that their work be open access, or requirements that come along with the funding that they have, that their work has to be open access. And that's been really interesting to find out the different variety of rules. And, you know, I mean, Romanic Review was just recently started being published by Duke. And so we found out, you know, the specifics of their requirements, which is basically a kind of green open access option for our journal, which allows people to publish preprints online. And so that's, you know, that's very reassuring to some of our authors. I mean, and also I think it speaks also to the comment or the question that somebody had about with the collapse of tenure and the changing profession. Like in general, I think it's good that the scholarship should be more widely available and not hidden behind paywalls whenever possible, especially when people are working outside of institutions.
Yeah, and this is a huge economic issue that every journal has to kind of, I mean, ultimately it would be great if there were larger regulations, right? But each journal has to kind of work out this open access issue. We have discussed this extensively with University of Chicago Press, and we've had, it's a bit of a tug of war, and we've had to negotiate certain things can be open access on a very limited basis. They don't want to make it that people won't subscribe to the journal anymore, right? So there's a kind of a back and forth about how much can be open access. If authors, the one issue that has come up with many people have commented on who are European scholars, that some European funders, that is government funding in Europe, requires open access publication. They will not allow the authors to publish behind a paywall. And in those cases, actually, it turns out, we found out upon inquiry that there can be a negotiation and a discussion. It can happen. But it's just that nothing happens unless you get in touch. When I say you, I don't mean you, the authors. I mean the editors on behalf of the authors, unless you get in touch with the publisher and start negotiating. So unless it's an open access journal, which we're going to be hearing more about from Michelle Wilson, if it's a journal that's behind a paywall, normally there has to be a conversation, there are guidelines, and it's amazing what you can find out if you're persistent enough. So we all need to be proactive about these. Now, let me just see. Anne Levitsky says, are there journals that only allow one revise and resubmit? I personally don't know. Does anybody else know on the panel? I don't know if journals allow only one. I don't know if I haven't heard of it. If it's something is desk rejected, you can't resubmit it. It would have to be a different, if it's officially a desk reject, it would have to be a different submission. It couldn't be the same, because desk reject means they're not going to send it out. So different meaning different enough to make it totally different. Yeah. And now I think what we should do is move on, and because we're going to continue looking at the chat and figuring out what we would like to get to. But I want to thank everybody who muted myself by mistake. So now I want just to get myself back. Okay. So now we're going to hear from Alex Giel and Kaiama Glover. So Alex Giel from Columbia University Libraries, Kaiama Glover from the Barnard College Department of French. about their journal that they have founded and co-edit, Archipelagos, which is different from the other journals that we've discussed so far. I wanted just to mention the first 3 journals. Ours is Scholarly Society sponsored. And then the one that Callum, the journal that Callum edited is published by a department at Columbia. It's overseen by a department. And so is the Romanic Review, which Pier, Mattia, Tommasino, and Seth Kimmel discussed. And also, those are rather old journals in a way. They were founded a long time ago, whereas Archipelagos is more recently founded, and it's a born digital journal, and Alex and Kaiama founded it. So we wanted to ask, at least I wanted to ask, how does peer review work in Archipelagos, and what are the benefits of the way that Archipelagos does things for fostering new work in the field? So please take it away.
Hi, Susan, thank you for inviting us. I'll be speaking first, 5 or 6 minutes, and then I'll pass the mic to Kaiama. And I want to really quick just go over what Archipelagos does, because it has 3 valences or 3 sections, and the review kind of changes. The game of review changes. First and foremost, it is a journal that was created to sort of nurture the field of digital scholarship as it relates to Caribbean studies. So Caribbean studies is a field that's been established for many decades. Now, what we wanted to do was create a home for digital scholarship expressions within these fields. That means both digital humanities work in Caribbean studies, as well as new media studies work, science and technology studies work within Caribbean studies, right? So we have 3 valences in which we are able to both connect the traditional ways of doing things with new ways of doing things in order to give value to the new work, which we found before we started the journal was not necessarily readily translatable to departments, to tenure and promotion committee, to dissertation committees, to promotion committees, etc. So we wanted to actually, at least the work of digital humanities, to make it a little bit more legible. And this is one of the motivations of why we found this journal. And this will explain the 3 valences. So in the first valence, or the first section called essays, we do traditional double-blind peer review. The authors submit an argumentative essay, and they don't know who the reviewers are, and the reviewers don't know who the author is. In the second valence, authors or teams submit a digital humanities project or a progress or narration report on a digital humanities project. That one is only single blind, because it is almost impossible to hide who are the authors of a digital humanities project, because by definition, it's a public humanities project. It already exists on the internet, so everybody knows who are the creators of the project. But in this case, though, the creators, the team, doesn't know who the reviewers are. And then the third section could be, we call digital project reviews, could be equated to what we call book reviews. So in this case, the review is publicly. There is no blindness to it. The reviewer signs the review, and it is of a public project. So there's 3 different modalities of review that are being explored here. And we felt that combined, they actually give us the flexibility to nurture the field in the specific ways we wanted to nurture. By doing the first section as a double blind, we signal to colleagues in departments that that this is the type of work that this is the type of work you're already familiar with. This is the type of work, you don't have to change the rules in order to sort of accept this type of work. But that this type of review can coexist next to these other forms, both of review and of scholarship itself, as a way to start trying to change the ways we understand what is a valuable scholarly project. Now, of course, one of the things that defines digital humanities is, of course, the use of sound, video, of interactive maps and visualizations. So these not only, this is where the game gets interesting, these not only are a feature of the digital humanities projects here, but actually our essays themselves allow for a certain kind of multimedia. So for example, this is an essay on Brathwaite's sound archive as it's used in the classroom. And we have actual sound that you can listen to on the essay. This is where the born digital part. So I will let you explore the journal in more detail. We wanted to more or less start a conversation around the journal here, and this opportunity that we have around how can we connect the sort of traditional forms of doing review with future-oriented forms of review that can incorporate these new forms of scholarship. And we can talk in more detail after Kaiama and I are done about also the other ways in which Archipelagos itself is pushing the boundaries. Certainly in the second session, which we will talk about infrastructure, we'll talk about the uniqueness of the way that Archipelagos is built, which may not be appropriate here, but that is worth mentioning just because it does change the review game in answer to Hannah's question. So we actually proposed to the NEH when we were founding the journal. That's my 5-minute mark. So I'll take 1 more minute. That we will actually reduce the cost of production. And the NEH gave us our original seed grant in order to do the journal with the sort of like a promise that we would actually reduce the cost of the overall production of a contemporary journal that does not lose or skimp on all the added value that university presses or corporate publishers add to their journals. Michelle Wilson was an important part of this process. But in any case, one of the things that we had to give up in order to reduce the cost of production was this kind of continuous rolling submissions, right? That is a feature of a lot of the digital journals today, which is like you can submit an article at any point during the process, and the process will kick in just for you, and your article will be done as soon as that process is over for your article, which will probably work better for marginalized communities and communities of authors outside of the tenure track. But in our case, we cannot. In order to reduce the cost, we actually cannot have more than 1 issue a year. So this is one of our sort of periodicity is tied to sort of the ethics of what we can and cannot do, or the equity of what we can or cannot do. So it's bear mentioning, even though we will have a longer conversation about that in the second session, about the materiality of the journal. Kaiama?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for inviting us into this conversation. I don't have a terrible amount of information to add to that. Maybe just two points. One, actually, I'll start with this. The first is just to say that the journal was founded in, and I think our peer review process really attempts to communicate what we've considered since the beginning an ethics of care for the community that we're trying to nourish. As Susan mentioned, we are fairly new on the scene, and that means that for us, every kind of person who reaches out to engage with the journal, be they as an author or a reviewer, there is at this stage like an incredibly personal relationship that we establish in thinking through what it means for them to submit to the journal, what kind of timeline we're talking about. So we're incredibly communicative from the moment you reach out to us about what that timeline is going to look like, where in that year-long process they kind of fall, meaning if your article comes to us when we've just published, we let folks know that we're not publishing for another year. So keep in mind your own clock, your own exigencies before you determine if this is the right place for you. A second kind of thing to keep in mind is we're incredibly protective of our contributors. We protect folks from evil reviewer number 2, meaning we get our peer review in. And while one can say that the majority of reviewers are kind and thoughtful and generous, we think very hard about the tone and the language of reviews, and we incorporate and rework reviews into something that comes from us as the editors, meaning we want to be sure that we stand behind the way that a reviewer has spoken to a contributor or authors, and that's coming from us, and we are accountable to whatever is being communicated to an author. And this is really something, and when I'm talking about the personal in our peer review process, we are particularly protective of junior faculty and of graduate students. And I'll say that that's, something that I hope and I think we intend to continue going forward. The second sort of bigger thing to just point out about the journal, you don't have to share this, Alex, but if you do play around in the on the site, you'll see that we not only have submission guidelines and standards for contributors, we have standards for reviewers as well. And this is again about protecting the people who engage with our journals and making it clear that making transparent, not at all opaque, what we consider of the standards of what Archipelagos is trying to publish. So this is not only for the authors, but also for the reviewers. What should you be looking at? How should you be thinking about giving feedback to the authors? What are the specific frames of generative feedback you can give in any given instance? And actually, I'll add one last thing, because Susan brought up the desk reject and articles that don't make it to the peer review process. We've had this happen. It's been few and far between, but I will say that Alex and I have generally taken care to respond in these desk rejects, either with suggestions of how they can better submit to our journal or to another, but oftentimes because we are somewhat new on the scene and I would say even in that respect, perhaps more encouraging for folks to submit to us, particularly around our efforts to be more timely and transparent about the timing of the review process. We do sometimes have to say, this is great work, but look closely at what it is we're doing. We're a digital humanities journal. This is not exactly a fit. And I think, Alex and I are both aware that this corresponds perhaps to a feeling that there is this new space available for getting work out there, that is more adventurous perhaps, or new media or other things, but that not everything that involves digital things is right for a digital humanities journal. And I think kind of formulating helping our community understand that is something that's been important, an important part of our peer review process. There's one other thing I was thinking of that I can't recall offhand, but perhaps I'll get to it in the Q&A.
There's a couple of things in my notes that I think are worth mentioning because they came up earlier. Just little snippets of things that make the difference for us. Like one of them, for example, is that we actually sometimes, depending on the content, because it is a multidisciplinary journal, like we have contributions from communications, from media studies, from English, from history, from the library. Sometimes what we do is that we try to actually create a balance between the reviewers. So we would get somebody that addresses, and I think this is similar to what Mattia was talking about earlier. So we try to get them, for example, somebody who is an expert on the technique, and then with an expert on the subject. Like this is a very common situation for us, where we would try to match these two disciplines behind the scenes for you and reconcile those. And I just want to put an accent too on the mentoring part, because and I think Kaiama hinted at it, which is that and we're still trying to find the balance. We might be on the over mentoring side of the house right now, but it's something we care about and we feel is right. But it does add a lot of work to our plate as editors, and it might not be the most sustainable way once down the line as the journal becomes more established. But right now it feels right to actually work with junior faculty, with graduate students or non-faculty, to make sure that they get through, that they respond to the reviewers. And part of that is also making sure that we translate the reviewers' comments to them in a way that we feel will be constructive to them. So this is the part where reviewer number 2 gets filtered out a little bit, so that actually it doesn't end up being a destructive exchange, because we know that there's always a lot of baby in the bathwater of reviewer 2. So we just want to make sure that the authors get the baby, like how to improve their article.
I mean, this is incredibly valuable to hear about, because I feel like we all should think about this ethics of care that you're talking about. It's really, really important, because I think it's going to be the way to generate more and better scholarship, and to think about ways of dealing with peer review. And of course, you're in a journal where there's the topic, there's both digital humanities and the Caribbean, right? These are topics that are defined. Romanic review is much more a wider, although still defined, right? So I think it's really important to think about how do you create, you create the, create the field, but foster the field, like participate in the field. How does the field, we've been thinking about with Gesta, how do we get more submissions in areas that are not well represented until now? How do we also get involved in the fostering and the development of the field? How does and they spoke about this in the Romanic review as well. Like how does a journal maintain an identity or create an identity while also shaping that identity and responding to changes and developments in the academic fields that are related to the journal? I know current musicology has encountered this as well. So yes, so you have a question here. I'd like to hear actually the two panelists, Alex and Kaiama, speak about. I'd be interested to hear more, says Alexandra Mendes, how you came up with these reviewer guidelines, which sound to me like, in some sense, a way of marking an editorial approach. In this case, one that is trying to be supportive of a scholarly community. So how did you come up with those guidelines?
So, well, two things in there. Maybe one, just before answering that, just to dial back to the words you were using, Susan, because I think they're really important. You talked about fostering versus creating a community. And I really wanted to put an emphasis on that. When we came to put this journal together, it was very much not, oh, we're going to create a field or we're going to do something brand new that's never ever happened before. On certain levels, it was about, we want to create a space, a repository for things that are happening, but that are perhaps not being recognized or given the value that they should be. We want to create a landing pad, in a sense, for a community. And I think that, to leading into the answer to this question, is what is underlying this kind of ethics of care that is part of Archipelagos. We literally had an email exchange today, I sent an email to Alex, where I said, what I don't want to be doing in the case of particularly fraught submission that we just got, as I don't want to be gatekeeping. And I think that's really front of mind in our development of the journal and of the reviewer standards, is we want to start with yes, and how can we nourish, foster, to use your word, sustain, et cetera, as opposed to kind of create standards that are excluding or anxiety producing or shutting downing for those who are taking the risk of publishing in this new journal, and also experimenting with these forms that have been less recognized by the Academy. And as far as the reviewer guidelines are concerned, they started out of MLA, correct, Alex? They've been tweaked, but we started with MLA, and then from there thought together about which of these things and in what order would be most important to us. Again, if you want to look at the website, you can see the four components of review of the digital projects in particular. And something that's not on the site itself, but that goes out to our reviewers when we ask for anyone to do reviews, are a very finite one-page list of particular questions that we would hope they would engage in offering their review. And this is for us to be able to, we keep talking about reviewer number 2, but to rein in things that might be gratuitous or discouraging or in other ways unhelpful, to get to the meat of what is going to make this contribution stronger, clearer, and be able to communicate those things directly to an author in ways they can easily understand, right? There's nothing worse, and we all know this, than getting a review back on something where you can't figure out what you did wrong, or you can't really figure out what they're asking for. And so being explicit for us has been a first step of preemptively assuring legibility in the communication between the contributor and the reviewer.
Wow, this is incredibly helpful. And I think it's really an ideal transition to Michelle Wilson. I have thoughts that I'm going to bring up later, but I want to move to our next panelist, who is Michelle Wilson from Columbia University Libraries, and she is in charge of a digital journal publishing program. So when we were discussing this panel, Michelle was saying, well, she, the rest of us who spoke until now, we're dealing mainly with one journal. Michelle is dealing with 30 journals. And so Michelle has a bird's eye view. She's seen all these things much more than we have seen, much wider variety of practices, much greater amount of data really that Michelle actually has access to regarding journal publishing. So I wanted to ask Michelle to share her perspective on peer review as someone who works with all those different journals. So could you tell us, in addition to your views, also about some forms of peer review that might be different from some of the ways in which we've just been discussing peer review?
Sure. So I am the digital publishing librarian at our library, and I run, among a couple of other programs, a journal publishing program that has about 30 open access titles, and they really run the gamut in terms of subjects. We have a number of humanities journals, but we also publish in medicine and law and social work. And so I do see a wide variety of different practices in terms of editing and editorial workflows, different kinds of policy and different practices in peer review. And as you might expect, what works for someone who, including Archipelagos and Current Musicology, are two of the journals in our library's portfolio. And what works for one does not necessarily meet the needs of the other, as we heard in this conversation today, but also you can imagine among the different disciplines or subjects, and also based on things like how many people are working on the journal and whether it is run by senior scholars or graduate or even undergraduate journals. We have about 8 undergraduate journals that I work with. One of the other things that I think about as a library publisher, but also as a librarian, is that we're acting as the publisher for these journals. We are not necessarily involved in the day-to-day operations of every journal. And also as a librarian, I see myself as an educator and a mentor for many of our journal participants, our editors, many of whom are students. The idea of library publishing came out of a desire to create publishing opportunities and spaces and services that were more tailored to the needs of our community. We are your publisher, but we're also part of your community. We contribute to your classes. We talk with you about your research within the library, and we're trying to produce platforms and infrastructure and other services that are tailored to our needs and our ethos and ethics within the academy. And that's really guided us toward, for instance, having an open access publishing program, and leads us to want to encourage practices that are transparent and ethical and benefit the authors who are also a part of our community. We don't have that profit incentive. We are not, trying to come up with practices that will, churn out a certain amount of content on time so that we can receive certain subscription fees or licensing fees and things like that. So I'm really focused on trying to create the types of communities and practices that will give people the best possible experiences of interacting with our journals while still producing a high level of scholarship. However, because I am in the role of a publisher, I can't necessarily dictate, although I do have my own views sometimes on what might be a particularly good practice in terms of what forms of peer review and what kinds of practices help to foster good peer review and relationships between peer reviewers, editors, and authors. I can't necessarily dictate or tell journals everyone has to practice double-blind peer review, for instance, because it is considered by many disciplines to be a gold standard, or that journals should not practice double-blind peer review because it can be prone to things like inherent or unconscious bias. My role has been to set up opportunities through individual mentoring and conversations with our editors, workshops, especially for our student populations, to problematize and examine different kinds of peer review. So for instance, we talk about some of the pitfalls of double-blind review in being prone to things like inherent bias. There was a very small but interesting study that was done by the Canadian Journal of History many years ago, where they found that just by inviting more female peer reviewers, they published more articles by female authors, because there is inherent bias in the way that we read arguments, subjects, things like that, and decide whether or not they're worthy of publication. So we do have some journals that practice open peer review, which I know for many people here would not be the one that they would choose for their journal, because it means that both the editor and the author, or sorry, the peer reviewer and the author know who each other is in the review process. And that, I think, for some people might seem to open up issues where you do have bias or prejudice against a particular person or their views or their affiliation. But for some of our journals, particularly, we have a small, relatively new medical journal, and one of their goals is to foster community and conversation in their community. And for them, having this open dialogue between the reviewer and the author, and also publishing those peer reviews because the author knows who the peer reviewer was, they publish the reviews alongside the articles as typeset pieces. And that sort of creates for them that opportunity for conversation and community to happen, and also to credit and recognize the labor of the peer reviewer as well, which is something that people often find trouble with in the double-blind system, where the reviewer spends quite a lot of time and effort publishing or putting into the publishing process, but is not recognized for that work. The thing that I try to do the most with our program, like I said, is just to bring this information to our editors and to give them the opportunity to workshop and create policies to post those. And we often talk a lot about, I love a lot of the things that Alex and Kaiama said really resonated with my approach toward working, especially with our student and our undergraduate journal editors, in terms of having them think about and write down and publicly post their peer review policies and guidelines, and sometimes even sharing in advance the questions that they ask their peer reviewers, and having the way those questions are crafted and those guidelines are crafted and the language that's used there encourage constructive and formative feedback, and giving that sense of what the peer review process is supposed to be like in the materials that are posted there. And a little bit of a shameless plug, but I know that there are many graduate students who are here and are interested in this process. I really feel like there's a lot of value for our graduate student and especially our undergrad editors in participating in this process, not only in giving them a sense of what it's like to work on the publishing end of things at some point in their academic careers, but in demystifying and sort of making the whole thing a lot more approachable to them the first time they go into publishing their articles. And our undergraduates recently, only as of last year, did our undergraduate student journals start practicing peer review, and we invite graduate students to serve as the peer reviewers for our undergraduate journal and put out open calls for peer reviewers for those journals. And a lot of the graduate students who've participated in those journals have really felt like it has been a great opportunity for them to get their feet wet on providing that kind of feedback, structured for an author to work on their project, and sort of helps them to feel like, the peer reviewers who might one day be working on their work also have that kind of ethos in approaching their articles in the future, and making them feel a lot more comfortable with the process.
Thank you. This is incredibly, incredibly valuable. Thank you very much. And I wanted to ask you one of the questions in the chat. One person asked, Soraya asked, do you think that open review encourages the reviewer to be kinder in their wording?
I do think that it does. I think that, there are two sides to the coin. Susan opened up by saying, she feels strongly that double-blind review is a good way to get someone to, look closely and not to come to the conversation with any bias about that person's past work or something like that. But I think it reminds them that there is a real person on the other end of the process when they see that person's name, and that reminds them to think carefully about the language and the way that they would address that person as a colleague or someone who is in a position that they're mentoring. And there have been studies and anecdotal evidence that suggests that open review is one way to foster a conversation that is more collegial and can be a little bit, as you say, kinder in the wording.
Thank you. And another question is, Christina is asking, do you see pros and cons of journals using reviewers from a set board versus those identifying individual reviewers for each paper?
I mean, I think that just based on some of the other conversation that I've heard here today, that it really does give a lot of value to authors to match them up with a peer reviewer who is a specialist in their subject area and can give them that really close reading and that tailored and knowledgeable advice about the subject that they're speaking on. One of the, I mentioned for our undergraduate journals, we do an open call for reviewers, which is a nice way to get some new voices also into the conversation so that you're getting more diverse and wider perspectives that are becoming part of the conversation that's happening around your journal. If you just have this one small group of peer reviewers that have been collected together by your editorial board that might not have changed for a while, then you're going to be getting a lot of maybe the same kinds of articles selected for publication and a lot of the same methodologies and things like that. So having a larger group of people called in, perhaps because you're getting someone who's a expert in that particular subject, but also just casting a wider net and getting new voices into the conversation, I think is really valuable. From that point, though, it is we do an open call for peer reviewers, but we do vet them, look at their credentials, and try to match them up with people who are writing about the subjects that they are expert in.
Thank you very much. I think it's a great topic, this question of widening the conversation, something that Seth also brought up earlier. Who is part of the conversation? How do we get more people to be part of the conversation? And what you just described shows different ways of approaching that and different ways of trying to think creatively about getting people involved in the conversation, scholarly conversation. And the current musicology journal with which we started, people can be on the editorial board if they're basically graduate students in the Department of Music. And that's one way of actually bringing, okay, yes, it's a department, but the point is it's a lot of people, that are serving on the editorial board. So you can get a lot of people involved that way who take ownership of the journal. I mean, one thing that we've done in Gesta is what we've noticed is when we invite peer reviewers, we are trying to invite as often as possible people who have never reviewed for the journal before. So we have greatly expanded the number of people who have reviewed. So we're trying to bring in more and more people, and sometimes early career reviewers as well, and just widen the participation. It was interesting your comments about innate bias, because I think art history, which is the field of Gesta, is in many ways a very female field. There's really a lot of female authors, a lot of female peer reviewers. So this question of, do you invite more inviting more female peer reviewers and then publishing more authors who are female is kind of already the case in a way in art history. So I think it's very different depending on the different fields. So Alex has his hand up. Alex, please.
Hi, yeah. I know we won't have time to discuss today, but I think one of the things that I noticed throughout the questions and the comments kept hinting at a sort of a tension that we have there, something that came up in conversation earlier when we were planning the panel with Seth, which is that we have to find a balance between sort of realism and sort of what we want, right? In the future, it's kind of like what Archipelagos itself is a manifestation of a compromise with traditional ways of doing things and maybe pointing in some directions forward, because we cannot deny sort of like the economy of prestige that is actually determining the fate of many of our graduate students or even of our junior faculty. So in that sense, as I hope probably in the third session, we can go back to this question of what journal should I publish in, and where and what mechanisms should that journal have, because it would be unethical for me to recommend to a graduate student that they don't pay attention to the super established, very prestigious journals that are the ones that 2 or 3 people in the job hiring committee are going to be saying, oh, but they publish in Modernity and Modernism, where they publish here and there. So this is like, that's undeniable. In your tenure and promotion, when you come up against the tenure committee, they're going to look at whether the press was good or not. This is just, those people are still in those committees. those voices are still very much real, and they have a real impact on people's lives. And this is where I think this is the tightrope that we have to straddle, and I hope we address it directly in the future, because this has a lot to do with review as well. I bring it up here because it is within the theme of review and what kind of review one should be seeking or pursuing as we transition to a different way of doing things.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I want to ask if, I have a couple of thoughts I wanted to share about practices, but I wanted to ask before I do that, whether other members of the panel want to either ask questions or respond to Michelle as Alex did.
Maybe can I just add that one of the really rewarding things about being an editor is you get to follow those networks further and further out from your area of specialty. And so, I mean, it's a pretty common thing, I think, to ask a reviewer if they can't review a particular article to suggest 2 or 3 other readers. And I think that's the place. Once those readers suggest other readers, then all of a sudden those networks get wider and wider. And it's really illuminating to see how those networks work on the one hand, but then also to learn about people's work that you hadn't known about before. And that I think is one simple way. I mean, it's limited too, but it's a simple way to kind of expand that network a little bit, and to make that, Alex is talking about the economies of prestige, to make them a little bit more diffuse wherever possible.
I wanted to add that one thing that's come up a lot in the questions, and also that we've alluded to, but we haven't gotten into much detail on, is the role of the editorial board. Because, probably, I've been on so many editorial boards, probably every editorial board is different from probably every other one. There's probably as many ways of being an editorial board as there are journals. And one way of expanding the network and enlarging conversation, widening the conversation, as Seth was saying earlier, is also working on what does your editorial board do? Who are they and what do they do? And how do they view things? So I heard references to, longstanding editorial boards. The Gesta one rotates. So every 3 years, there's a small group. It's a small board, but every 3 years, 1/3 rotates off and new people come on. So when we began thinking, well, what can we do to make the journal more diverse? We thought, well, the first thing we can do is start with the editorial board. Now, the function of the editorial board is that they don't actually make decisions. When we have a journal, when we have a submission that we want an opinion on before we send it out for peer review, we send it to a member of the editorial board in that field. So it's medieval art history, which is a pretty large field, but still, member of the editorial board in that field. And then we ask them to either recommend, make a recommendation about the article, recommend some readers, possibly do a report themselves. But we have recourse to these specialists who are specialists in the areas in which we typically receive submissions. So the first thing we thought was, well, if we can bring in more people into the editorial board who represent areas of expertise that are not well represented in the journal, and also people who themselves represent underrepresented groups who have not traditionally been on the editorial board, our editorial board will then the journal will start to change as well. And so we changed our editorial board, and we also decided we would, whereas typically, because of the kind of work that we asked them to do, we would typically have been asking very senior scholars to be on the board. We said, no, we're going to start asking people who are not necessarily senior scholars, because we want to reach, demographics and subject areas that are not always among the senior scholars. So that was one thing that we did. And, it's very helpful. And it actually brought in some perspectives. We've started also meeting with our editorial board. Not all editorial boards actually have meetings. And the Gesta one did not have formal meetings. So we started a practice of having meetings, specifically talking about diversity efforts and ways, the challenges of diversity, what we could do about Gesta. And, we got perspectives in the board of all kinds, including one person who works on, for instance, Ethiopia and Islamic art, and started talking about, well, what about the institutional affiliations? He said, how many people in different parts of the world feel that they can publish in Gesta? How is Gesta open to and welcoming to people from all kinds of institutions in places, all over the place, that are not necessarily North America and Western Europe. And that's a conversation that we also need to have. We get submissions from all over the place, but clearly there are people who don't know about the journal or don't know that the journal is the right place for their work, and we would like to see their work ultimately potentially in the journal. So those kinds of conversations can also happen not only through who you choose as reviewers per se, but also when you think about how the journal functions with regard to the editorial board. And one more thing I wanted to say, which I think is probably obvious, but it's also not obvious, which is that when you're an academic and you have gone to graduate school, no one teaches you really how to do peer review. I mean, you kind of learn by doing how to advise graduate students, but the art of writing peer review, a reader's report on a submission is not something you learn. Current musicology actually teaches that. The graduate students on that board learn that. But it's a skill which is different from being a mentor and advisor. It involves that knowledge, and it involves that kind of thinking, but it's an art of itself. I don't know if people will agree with me on that, but I think that some of the problems with peer review may be because nobody ever actually learned how to do peer review.
Well, certainly the more mentoring, the better. I would like to return to the editorial board also, because what you were saying is it's very important. And as a member of the editorial board of Philological Encounters, that is a journal on global philology, so that put together different schools and different conception and rethinking of philology in the world. I've seen this shift. At the beginning was an editorial board that was not active, and then Islam Daye changed completely the editorial board, asked us for much more commitment and sharing ideas, reading articles and book proposals also, because they have, and this has been a very rewarding experience. I learned a lot from people that I didn't know and so on. So a large, to make wider and reach large group is very important, but also important to have a core of people that are interested. It's diverse. It's a group that is very diverse, but the discussion is always going on. And this has been very interesting intellectually within the group, but also then to know more about peer reviewers and so on. So, and also the timeline of the board is very clear. So there will be not people that stay there for a long time, but there will be a clear timeline for the board and the commitment in that in this board. So it's a group that I constantly am in contact with, and it has been very interesting.
I wanted to ask if, as we're reaching closer to the end of the event, if people who either asked a question that never got answered, or, because I'm looking at, there's a lot in the chat, either asked a question that never got answered or would like to ask another question, if they could put it in the chat just so that we make sure we get to the questions that people have. That would be helpful for me. I'm just looking to see if we covered things that people wanted to know, because we don't have to go all the way till 7 necessarily. We could, we can wrap up earlier. And Michelle, did you have more that you wanted to say, or were you done? I was curious to know more about those examples of open peer review that you were mentioning, where there are like you were saying that there were annotations on the, I mean, are those in humanities journals too?
We have a couple of journals. We publish a project that is published serially, but it is on citational practice. We're also working with a journal that is an experimental music journal, and both of those journals are practicing a form of peer review, which is open, but they are publishing the peer reviews as annotations on the initial drafts that were submitted to the journal alongside the final published pieces. So they are sort of using the peer review as a way of both demonstrating the conversation, but also in a way, I think for the experimental music journal in particular, also sort of creating another form of art or sort of a commentary on the peer review process in the way that it's been presented. I think that for me, what Alex was saying about encouraging what is, what we would like to see versus what is practical, it's exciting for me when we have partners who are interested in pushing the envelope or being a little bit more creative with the peer review process and thinking about, what kinds of interesting products could come out of allowing these conversations to sit in the open. And so I've been really interested in, there are also technical and workflow challenges involved in some of these in terms of how we'll present those kinds of materials or how we'll use the systems that we have to manage the peer review. So we use a product called Open Journal System to facilitate our editorial processes, and it's a conversation about how we literally utilize the tools that we have to do our publishing in order to facilitate some of these processes that are a little bit more creative or not what they were originally designed for. The majority of the journals in our program do practice double-blind peer review, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that they want to be competitive journals in their fields and feel like they need to continue to participate in that widely accepted system.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. I mean, one thing that I think we're going to be bracketing and saving for the next workshop will be this whole question of production platforms and publishing, the techniques, because one thing that comes up, of course, for us in the music field too, is multimedia. This is something Callum is going to want to talk about in February, what are the challenges facing multimedia journal publishing and use of media in the existing platforms. And there's a whole interesting history that I know about this too. So that's a whole thing. But I see a really good question in the chat, which I think it would be really nice if each of the groups or whoever individuals would like to respond to would be really helpful. So Sabina has written, what makes an article a work that is selected for peer review? And then what is the percentage of articles published compared to the ones received in your journals? So maybe we could think of those two questions together. What is it? What makes it worthy of being selected for peer review in your mind? And then, and like summarizing this, and then what is the percentage on the whole in your journals? Why don't we start with, should we just go in the order that we originally went with or go backwards? Maybe go backwards. Why don't we go backwards? Let's start with Kaiama and Alex. I mean, we can start with Michelle, but I think you were saying, Michelle, that you felt like you weren't being asked to pass that judgment, to make that judgment call on whether something is worthy of being. So is that okay if we start with Kaiama and Alex? Yeah, Kaiama and Alex.
So for us, when we ask for pitches or abstracts, what we want to make sure is that there's no misunderstanding because of what our mission is. Because we are, in a sense, sort of stepping into interdisciplinary territory that might not be clear to all disciplines. There is always room for sort of a miscalculation. And we do get proposals that they just don't fit into what we're trying to do here. And we're very broad. but that still happens. Like we actually have very clear, detailed guidelines of like what are the boundaries, or as fuzzy as they are, in what we want to hear about and what we want a discussion on. So like once in a while, we get for every issue we would get like 3 or 4 proposals that just don't fit. In terms of the overall process, then after that point, so say that's like what, 10% or something like that, then after that point, then the people who don't get through are more rare, because we do work hard to make sure that the quality of the published piece is good. So for us, the goal of peer review, just to reiterate what was said between the lines, the goal for us is to produce good scholarship and to produce, to put our name behind articles and pieces that we feel our public is not going to be wasting their time with. So we do put in the effort. I know that many journals sort of like do a shorthand version of quality by saying, well, if we only accept 10 out of 100, that must mean they were very good quality. We didn't buy that logic. We feel that, I mean, we achieve quality because we work throughout the process. So in that sense, the ones that don't make it through to the end are rare. They do happen, but they're rare. Kaiama, does that sound about right?
Yeah, I will just say again, I was going to put this in the chat earlier in response to Alexandra's kind remarks about our process. To be very, very clear, if it hasn't been made clear enough, it is a very labor-intensive effort on Alex and my part, and I think we're not there yet. What are we in issue 5 going on 6? Maybe talk to us again on issue 15 if this ends up being sustainable. But for now, as I said in my remarks earlier, our attentiveness to creating and nourishing a community that trusts us and that will continue to deliver like work to us that we feel is good scholarship and that's valuable to our field. We're kind of standing by authors in that way right now. But it is maybe not sustainable into the infinite future, I'll say that. But we'll have to find things that keep us close to that metric of that standard for our journal.
Thank you very much. So going backwards, what about Seth and Mattia?
I think we're too new to the journal to know the details about the numbers, but I would say that we're all sort of working together in the way that Alex and Kaiama are talking about to try and support the sorts of articles in the fields that we want to incorporate into Romanic review. So I'd say that we're eager to receive and to foster and to help to revise, maybe over multiple readings, articles that push the journal in that direction in particular. So it's not that it's, it's not that we're tougher on one subset of Romance philology than others, but we're, and I think this is probably true for most journals and most editors, that if you're trying to, to develop certain conversations and to help them thrive, that you invest a lot of time, especially in those directions. And so, again, I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but I would say that I'm keen to see and to help get published articles that that come from those other languages and areas that Romance philology used to deal with more, but has dealt with less more recently.
Callum, do you have a sense? I know it would probably change from year to year. Do you have a general sense?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, in my first issue, we received just under 50 submissions. I think it was about 48. And that includes submissions for book reviews and also for a colloquy. And I think we ended up publishing about 20 individual things. I don't know the breakdown of articles, book reviews, and colloquy pieces, but and then for the second issue, we received 34 in total, and then we're going to be publishing 7 but some of that 34 are things that were kind of revised and resubmitted, and then there are things that are going to keep on going. So the process is kind of not over for a lot of these things. So a
But
lot of that is ongoing.
Can you speak to what made them the ones that you would send out for peer review? Can you speak to those? What qualities made those the ones that you would choose to send out for peer review or not, as opposed to the ones that you didn't?
Yeah, well, actually, this goes back to something very interesting that Michelle was saying, is that I started at a time that we were also, there was also this new experimental music journal that was opening up, which was actually kind of a godsend for our peer review process, because Current Musicology is a kind of, it's a scholarly musicology journal, but we were receiving a whole ton of kind of more experimental, more kind of out there submissions that kind of defied the limits of our peer review process, that were better suited to this new journal. So we were able to do a whole bunch of like essentially desk rejects. We were able to send them on to this other journal, and so we were able to kind of feed into this new ecology that's building around the music department. There aren't actually that many graduate student musicology journals in the world. There's us, there's I think one in Texas, there's one at the CCM. So, there's only a handful. So now that there are more developing, we're able to, these kind of rejections are easier to handle, and we're able to kind of pass them on, and there's more venues for that, if that makes sense.
That is a good thing, and I think in another workshop that would be a good thing to talk about is that larger, the macrocosm, of the different journals that you think about, because we often will recommend to authors to send their work to a particular other journal, and I think that's some part of the stewardship that we should have. But speaking for Gesta as the last person, I'm not sure. It's hard to estimate. I mean, Gesta is a very, very, very top-ranked journal, like it's way at the top. So typically, I don't think we accept more than 20%. I think maybe even less of submissions. But we do work very closely with some, and sometimes we work very closely even for years with some articles, and then ultimately we have to reject them because the authors can't quite bring them up to the standard. But anyway, what makes an article for us to send it out for peer review is, it has to be an original contribution. It has to be clear what is original about this contribution. What is it doing? It has to be clear what the author knows about the field and what the author is doing to move the field forward. Those two things have to be clear. And obviously, if it's a mess, as we spoke about, things to do with writing problems, which are by no means limited to people for whom English is not a native language, right? We have to be clear about that. It's for all people who write, may not write well in some cases. And so if there are problems with the submission, then in those cases, we would not send it out for peer review. So I think it has to be well written. It has to properly, to the greatest possible extent, follow guidelines. And it has to be an original work of research that really is going to be doing something new and making a new contribution. So for us, we would need that to send it out for peer review. Sometimes we're not sure if it's totally, making a big difference as an original piece of, we can't quite tell. But anyway, that would be our desire. And one last question, because we will wrap up. Once an article is selected for peer reviews, what are the chances of it getting published? That's going to depend, as Alex wrote, on the journal. It's going to depend so much, because as we've heard in this wonderful panorama, some journals are going to go the distance. They're going to work with that author, and they are going to work with that author until that submission is publishable. And then other journals are going to try to go the distance, but then at a certain point they might give up. So I would say that question varies a lot. So I think we're going to be, leading into the final, wrapping this up. I wanted just to encourage people to please consider attending the other workshops, because there are many, many things that we didn't talk about here that I think are really important subjects that will be covered. One of them is going to be February 2nd, 2022. And one of them is going to be on April 4th, 2022. And in the final workshop, we will, I think, talk a little bit about what could be some solutions, not necessarily utopian. I think if we took some of the strategies and practices that were described today and applied them to more journals, even in our tiny group here, that could make a big difference in the future. And really thinking about how we could, adapt or emulate certain practices, or just reflect on practices and come up with maybe new guidelines or expanded guidelines or more transparency or, different ways of thinking about timelines. I think we could really make a difference for a lot of people, and also for our editors. Those who will follow us in the editorial positions that we currently occupy would benefit in many ways from having procedures that could be changed. So one question is, if we register for this, we will get reminders. Yes, it's been set up that people are going to be getting an email about those future workshops and being, getting either a reminder or a registration link or something like that. So they will. So I want to really thank everybody for scheduling this, for taking the time to be here, to share your thoughts with us, to have a really thoughtful conversation. And your input is incredibly interesting, and I hope has been useful to the people who attended. And thank you very much for all the questions, because the questions that people asked were very pertinent and gave us a sense of what people need to find out. So Anya is going to be closing down the Zoom call shortly. And thanks to all of you. I'm going to just put my email in the chat, because I noticed a few folks who might potentially want to ask questions. When you look at the announcement of the announcement of these 3 workshops, you'll see there were links online for all the panelists. You can read all about, more about all of them. All of us all have our biographies linked. So everybody have a great Monday evening, and we hope we'll see you again at the next event in February. Thank you very much to all.